Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at a topic that is very important but doesn't get a ton of attention, and that is startup configuration and how to open a TouchDesigner project with custom parameters that are passed in at startup to set things like maybe resolution or whether or not to open and perform or output monitor. Um, these can all be set using something called a bat file and some environmental variables. And with just a little bit of Python, we can pass all of this into TouchDesigner to actually have these variables take effect when we are opening our file. This is super helpful because sometimes there's a situation where perhaps you have a production resolution that's maybe like huge, like 8K or something, but you're developing on a little laptop computer that can't handle that resolution. And so you need to set the resolution to something like, I don't know, 1920 by 1080 to be able to develop. However, if for whatever reason you can't even open the file due to the massive resolution and your GPU just doesn't have the memory to even initialize and open that, it would be very difficult for you to go in and change the resolution so that you can work on it. The technique that we're about to look at right now solves this problem by allowing us to pass in some variables at project open and kind of define how the project actually starts up itself using a couple pretty easy to write scripts. So that is what we're going to be taking a look at today. And I think perhaps I will just delete and rebuild. So a couple things. One, this content is literally just two noises put together, so there's nothing special going on there. I'm not going to delete that. I am going to delete this startup section, and this is the part that we'll be recreating. So there's a little extension that we'll write, a small configuration table that we'll set up, and then this execute dat, which is doing the heavy lifting. Now, two things that I do want to note before I start, and that is I have a global ops shortcut called perform that's set to this perform window, window comp. And my project container also has a global ops shortcut called project. I have output resolution as this variable on my project container that is also tied to the height and width of the project. And then that project container is what is being used for the window operator. So basically, this output resolution is what determines the resolution of the actual output to the display, as it sets the resolution for this container, the size for this container, and then this container is what the window operator is actually pushing out to the display. So with that said, if we want to set a special variable like resolution on startup, in my setup right now, this output resolution, X and Y, is the variable that we need to be addressing. So how to go about doing this? First, we set up just a base, and I will call this startup. I'm going to give my base a parent shortcut that I'm also going to call startup, just to keep things tidy. Now, first, inside of this, I'm going to customize my component. I'm going to add an extension, and I'm just going to call it startup extension. I will add it, and I'll edit it in a second. Just make that a little bit bigger. Now here is where we're going to be setting up a table that I'm going to call startup config. And this configuration table is going to be holding all of our variables that we want to set before we start up our file. So I'm going to add a couple rows and a couple columns. This first we'll call mode, and then I want my res x, my res y variable, and then I'm going to have another one called open perform. Now we can have one mode that'll be called dev, And this one we can use 1920 by 1080 as the resolution, and then we'll use a 0 for open perform because we don't want this to open a perform window if we're just developing. However, let's say we have a production mode that'll be 4K output, and this one we do want to open in a perform window. So I'm just going to leave that as is. That should be all that we really need right there. And then the last piece is going to be this execute dat. An execute dat will simply run some code on any of these actions. So we can turn on start to run some code on our project startup. And then here we will call a function that we're about to define in our extension. So I'm going to just call it right now, parent.startup, because of that parent shortcut that we used. And then our function will be called onStart, and we'll take no arguments. Now let's get VS Code over here. I will blow this up a little bit. Hopefully everyone can see all right. Now we'll get rid of some of this extraneous stuff. And very good. So first we can just set up the shell of our onStart function that will take in self as a argument to reference this class extension. And now we want to do something on startup and then return. Now this function is the same as the one that we're calling in our onStart. So if, for example, I just print do something, then I open a text port in TouchDesigner, which actually I'll open here. I'll open a text port. There you go. And now if we just pulse this, we can see that we're printing do something out in our text port. So it looks like our pipeline is working. Now onStart is where we want to put this logic to kind of hold this startup configuration. So basically, we want to say if our startup mode is dev, use those values for the resolution, etc. And so how do we do that? Well, first we need to pass a mode into our program. I'm going to do that in just a second, so hold on to that. Right now, I'll just write mode equals dev and hard code that. Now I'm going to just create a variable inside of this little function called resx. I will add self.config table and then reference that startup config table dat that I created. And so now we have this self.config table attribute that I can reference elsewhere in my script. And so now I can write resx equals self.config table, and I'll take the row from mode variable, and then in this case I want my resx column. Oops. Now I'll copy that, I'll paste it, and we'll simply do the same for resy. And then last, we will do perform, and that will be self.config table, and then we'll grab the mode again, and this column is called open perform. Now we have to do something with these variables, so I can use this project global op shortcut. So I'll define a couple more members here. Self.project will equal op.proj, so using that global reference. And then I'm going to say self.perform equals op.perform, which again is a global reference that I mentioned at the beginning. Now we have these set up, and so now we can use them to actually set our variables. for example, self.project.par.output resolution x.val equals resx, and then obviously the same for resy. Resy. So now we have our resolution, and then we need to simply perform. We need to simply now open the performance window if we want to. So if perform equals 1, then what we want to do is use our self.perform.par.performance.pulse. And this will, again, if we just go and take a look at our perform window comp, this open as perform window is a parameter called performance, so that's what we're pulsing right there. So now, if we have our dev mode and we go back, let's open these so we can see this happen. And now we go back into our startup and pulse this again, we would expect the resolutions here to change from 3840 to 2160 to 1920 by 1080, because that's what we configured here for our dev mode. Now, I got an error, and that is, well, because I have a capital Y here, and that's wrong. And there we go. So now I have 1920 by 1080, and that is set. And so now if I change this back to prod and hit pulse again, I guess you can't see that because my performance window opened, but the output resolution updated to 3840 by 2160, and then my performance window actually did open. I guess we could actually have another variable. We could say monitor equals 1. And then if we go to our perform here, we can check out, okay, there's a monitor variable. So we can say self.perform.par.monitor equals monitor. And so now, let's say I'll have this monitor set to 0. First, I'll run it in dev mode, which will set our output resolution back to 1920 by 1080. And now, when I change this to production and hit run one more time, or rather pulse this one more time, now I think that the perform window should open on this monitor, which it did, and we can see that the resolution changed, which is great, exactly what we want. So now, the only missing piece is to actually pass these variables into our program from outside of TouchDesigner, and we can do that by using a bat file. So I'm going to create a new file, and actually I'm just going to create, I have a couple already here from developing this, so I'm just going to do a new file and call it startup.bat, and I'll edit this file, and it's actually really simple to do what we need to do here. So a bat file is basically just a collection of command line expressions. So everything that we write in here is going to be essentially executed on the command line. So the easiest thing that we can do is if I go over here, I do file, I'll save as. I'll save this as bat tutorial.to. So in my example startup bat, I will simply just write start bat tutorial.to. Now, if I open a terminal, I need to make sure that my terminal is in my directory. So right now I'm in this startup file project directory where my startup bat lives. And then I can actually just say startup.bat. I'll close this. And then if I hit startup.bat, we can see that my TouchDesigner file is opening automatically as expected, or as if I had just double-clicked on the file itself. Now, that's exactly what we want. It's opening in perform mode, which is expected because our mode is set to prod there. And so that's essentially exactly what we would expect to have happened. Now we need to just create the mode, and we can do that by setting an environmental variable in this bat script. So we can say set, and then we can call this variable startup mode, and we can set it equal to, in this case, dev. Now, a couple things to note: make sure there are no spaces before or after this equal sign. And while this is a string, we actually are passing it in just as the letters, not wrapped in quotes. So what this will do is set the environmental variable startup mode to this value, dev, and it will stay set to that value for all of the programs that are started by the same file. What that means is that we can go back to this extension, and instead of using a hard-coded mode here, we can use this syntax, and we can grab the startup mode variable that we just defined. This var, open parenthesis, variable name in quotes, is the TouchDesigner syntax for grabbing an environmental variable. So that is exactly what we need to be able to use this environmental variable that we're setting up in our script. So I'll move this monitor back down into our perform because we don't actually need it unless we are opening in perform mode. And so I will just delete these others that I have set up from before, and I will rename this startup to startup dev. And that is because our startup mode is going to be set to dev in the script. Now, I will type startup dev .bat, and we can see that our file is starting up, and in this case it should start with a resolution of 1920 by 1080 and not in perform mode. Okay, so that stayed in perform mode, and that is because I forgot to save the file after we updated this extension to use the environmental variable instead of our mode. So I'll save, I'll close, and then I'll start one more time. And this will start up. Now, at the same time, I'm going to just copy and paste this bat file. I'm going to create another one that's called production or startup prod. Startup prod will have the prod characters as the startup mode, and I'm going to set another one, and this is going to be called perform monitor. And this I'll set equal to 0. Now our startup worked, and we can see that our resolution is 1920 by 1080, which is exactly what we would expect for this startup using the dev bat. Now the last thing that we need to change is to use that monitor variable. So we can actually just use the same syntax and use our perform monitor environmental variable that we just created here. And so now we can actually set our output monitor to a specific monitor without needing TouchDesigner open and actually setting that parameter manually. We can define it just in our bat file. So once again, I'll save this to save that extension. One thing that you could do to make this part a little bit smoother would be to save this file, save as, then I'll navigate to and then you can have a dat folder, and inside that dat folder, you can say startup extension and actually save it as a file. Then you can go and associate that file here, sync to on startup. This way you don't have to remember to save the file, to save the tow project every time you just update the extension. It will also let you update the extension without TouchDesigner open, which is pretty nice sometimes. So that can be a good complement to this technique. In any case, I will save now since we have now externalized this file. And I will, instead of startup dev, use startup prod.bat. And now we think that it should open in 4K and in perform on this screen. Which is not quite what happened. Okay, let's make sure that these... Aha. Jeez. Perform monitor. And now this should work. So we'll close this one more time. Classic typo. And we will start up our prod.bat. And there you go. Now it starts up in perform mode. And so there you have it. We now have the ability to start our TouchDesigner project using different startup configuration presets. We can additionally set the output performance monitor and open the perform window on open in some cases, but not all cases. Now, this is really just beginning to scratch the surface of what a bat file can do. You can change directories, you can open other files, you can open multiple TouchDesigner files. You can also confirm the TouchDesigner version inside of the bat file itself, so you can make sure you always open with the right version. There are a lot of these things that are very, very feasible to do inside of the bat file. So I'm not going to go through all of that today because I want to keep this brief and to the point. But hopefully this is a helpful overview on how you can use environmental variables and a bat file to have some more configurability when you're starting up your TouchDesigner projects, which I hope will reduce and resolve some headaches in the future. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for the continued support. The project files here are obviously available on my Patreon. And until next time, I wish you all the best.